On the morning of February 8th, 2010, 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell was sitting in her high school cafeteria in Wenatchee, Washington. Wenatchee was a small agricultural town nicknamed the apple capital of the world because of its thousands of acres of sprawling apple orchards in the area. And in the cafeteria, Mackenzie was sitting around a long table with her high school dance team, the Applettes, that was named after the town's biggest crop. Mackenzie loved dancing almost more than anything. And even when she wasn't doing routines with the dance team at football and basketball games, she would often dance her way down the halls to class or out to her car in the school parking lot. And as a high school senior, she was one of the leaders of the Applettes. And so she and some of the other seniors were talking about the new sweatshirts they wanted to design for the dance team. The girls talked about the different images they could put on the shirts and what color they should be. Mackenzie voted for her favorite color, purple. And then they just relaxed and talked about other things that were going on in their lives, like the boys they were dating, SAT scores, and what they wanted to do that weekend. Then the morning bell rang, and Mackenzie and the other girls grabbed their school bags, got up from the table, and headed to class. Mackenzie was 5 foot 8 inches tall, and she was pretty with long brown hair and red highlights. And she had braces on her teeth that she couldn't wait to get off. But even though her braces made her self-conscious, they didn't stop her from smiling at the other students she passed in the hall. And she knew the braces were a necessary evil if she ever wanted to live out her dream of becoming a model someday. That day at school was a pretty typical one for Mackenzie. She liked her classes and she loved getting to hang out with her friends at lunch, but she spent a lot of her time daydreaming about graduation and thinking about a time when she'd be able to pursue her goals outside of high school. And to that end, Mackenzie had enrolled at a cosmetology school, or what some people called beauty school, that allowed her to get out of her high school classes a little early every day. Mackenzie wanted to learn how to become a hairstylist and a makeup artist because she believed it could help her in modeling. But Mackenzie also loved the idea of doing something that could help other people look and feel their best. So that afternoon, Mackenzie went into a bathroom, dug her cosmetology school uniform out of her bag, and got changed into black pants, a black shirt, and a black apron, like she did most days during the week. Then she put on her coat and walked outside to her car in the high school parking lot. It was a cold day, a little under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but Mackenzie's coat and her fur-trimmed brown boots helped keep her warm. Mackenzie hopped into her red Pontiac Grand Prix, tossed her school bag and purse in the passenger seat, and then drove a few miles away to her cosmetology school. When she got there, she parked in the lot behind the school, grabbed her phone from her pocket, and sent a text message to her boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano. Joaquin was a few years older than Mackenzie, and he was busy working most days, so Mackenzie made sure to text him whenever she had a chance just to say hi, because she thought it was important for them to check in with each other even when they were busy. Then Mackenzie put her phone back in her pocket and headed into the school. Once inside, she stepped into a classroom that was set up like a working hair salon, and she gave a huge smile to her instructors and classmates. Mackenzie loved everything she was learning about hair and makeup at the school, but she also really liked having the chance to be around people of all different ages. Some of the students in her cosmetology classes were well into their 20s and even 30s, so Mackenzie felt much more like an adult with real freedom when she was there than she ever did at her high school. And she knew she could learn a lot from the other students because they had different backgrounds and life experiences than she did. One of the students, a 28-year-old man named Chris Wilson, had a mother who owned a salon. And so Chris was already really good at certain techniques like dyeing hair, and Mackenzie loved how Chris dyed his own hair, and so she had started practicing hair dyeing techniques on herself as well. And so every day when Mackenzie left cosmetology school, she felt like she was learning new skills, either from her teachers or from her classmates. And that evening, after another great day at beauty school, Mackenzie drove home, and as she did, she was in a really good mood. So she turned up her car stereo, blared her favorite song, and bobbed her head along with the beat. And as Mackenzie drove down a tree-lined street in her small neighborhood, she was excited about all the opportunities she was sure were going to come her way. Mackenzie pulled up to her mother's 2-story house and parked her car in the driveway. She grabbed her stuff from the passenger seat and then walked inside the house and went straight into the living room. But before she could even put her bags down, her mother's boyfriend walked in and started yelling at her. And any of that joy Mackenzie had felt when she was driving home had now completely disappeared. Mackenzie couldn't even tell what her mother's boyfriend was mad about, other than the fact that she had come home. Because for some reason, her mother's boyfriend did not like Mackenzie, And so Mackenzie just stood there while he shouted at her and got angrier and angrier, until finally Mackenzie told him to leave her alone, and she ran upstairs to her room, sat on her bed, and fought back tears. Then she grabbed her phone and called her dad. Mackenzie split time between her divorced parents' houses, and on the phone she told her dad she couldn't wait to come over to his house the following night. And her dad said when she came over, he would cook her a special dinner and make her an ice cream float, which had been her favorite dessert since she was a kid. By the time Mackenzie hung up with her dad, she felt a little better. But while she sat there on her bed, she thought about the argument she'd just had with her mother's boyfriend over seemingly nothing, and she decided she was not going to put up with him anymore. So Mackenzie sat there on her bed for a minute, took a few deep breaths, and really psyched herself up. Then she marched downstairs, found her mother, and she told her it was time to make a decision. Mackenzie said her mother could choose either her daughter, or her boyfriend, but she couldn't have both. And Mackenzie said if her mother's boyfriend stayed living at the house, she would move out for good. Her mother listened and tried to calm Mackenzie down, and then she promised she would think about what Mackenzie had to say. But later that night, Mackenzie went to bed without an answer from her mother. But as she drifted off to sleep, she tried to push any thoughts of her mother's boyfriend out of her head. She reminded herself that she was going to her dad's house the next day, and she knew that meant everything would be a lot better when she woke up. The next morning at 7:15 a.m., Mackenzie rushed out the front door of her mother's house and got into her red Pontiac parked in the driveway. Mackenzie wore jeans, a t-shirt, and her coat, and she had her cosmetology school uniform folded up neatly in her bag. And that day at school started just like the day before. Mackenzie walked into the loud cafeteria, where a group of high schoolers were hanging out and talking loudly before first period, and she made her way through the crowd to the table where her friends from the Applettes dance team were sitting. And the Applettes talked a little about the sweatshirts they wanted to make again, and after they'd talked for a while, the bell rang. So Mackenzie said goodbye to her friends and headed off to class. And later that day, she changed into her cosmetology uniform and drove to beauty school. And once she was there, she worked on some new hairstyling techniques and talked with her classmates like she always did. But then, at around 3 p.m., the students got a break, and Mackenzie told one of her classmates that she was going to leave during the break, but she'd only be gone for about 15 minutes, and she wondered if she had to sign out with the front desk before she did that. Her classmate said she didn't think so, and so Mackenzie just grabbed her coat, put it on over her uniform, and walked out the back door into the parking lot. Mackenzie slid into the driver's seat of her car, tossed her purse in the passenger seat, started the car, and turned on the heater. Then she grabbed her phone and sent a text to her boyfriend, Joaquin, that just said, "Hey." Mackenzie stared at her phone for a little bit, waiting for a reply, and just a few minutes later, Joaquin responded with, "Hey," as well. Mackenzie smiled, put her phone back in her pocket, and drove out of the cosmetology school parking lot. It was cold, but the sun was shining, and Mackenzie looked out the windshield and saw the barren apple orchards that lined huge parts of the town. And she thought that the empty orchards in winter were beautiful in their own way, but she really couldn't wait for summer when the apples would start growing again. At about 5:45 p.m., over 2 hours after Mackenzie had left cosmetology school on her break, her dad was at home in the kitchen cooking dinner. He glanced at his watch, picked his phone up off the table, and called Mackenzie. He knew she usually left cosmetology school around 5:30, and he just wanted to let her know dinner was almost finished and to see how close she was to the house. But Mackenzie didn't answer her phone, so he left a message for her and turned back to the food he was making. Mackenzie's dad knew that sometimes she stayed around after class to talk to her teachers and the other students, so he didn't think much of it. But after a while, when Mackenzie didn't show up and he hadn't heard back from her, he called her again. And when her phone went right to voicemail, he started to worry, and so he kept calling Mackenzie, but she never picked up. Then, a little while later, at 8 p.m., so about 4.5 hours after Mackenzie had gotten in her car in the parking lot, a local rancher was driving his truck on a dirt road on the land that he owned. The rancher approached one of his cattle gates on his land, and then he saw something which caused him to slam on his brakes. In the headlights of his truck, the rancher could see an abandoned car a few yards down the road. The rancher got out of his truck and ran to the car and looked through the window to see if anyone was inside, but the car was empty. People did not just abandon their cars like this on his land, and the rancher worried that the driver might be injured somewhere nearby. So he ran back to his truck, climbed in, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Not long after that 911 call, Mackenzie's dad was sitting on the couch in his living room. He was nervously tapping his foot on the floor and calling Mackenzie again and again, but still not getting through. It had been almost 3 hours since she should have come home, and he still hadn't heard anything. And when his daughter's phone went right to voicemail one more time, Mackenzie's dad hung up and just put the phone down next to him. But minutes later, the phone rang, and Mackenzie's dad answered without even looking at the number of the caller, hoping he would hear his daughter's voice. But instead, a police officer introduced himself on the other line, and Mackenzie's dad knew something was terribly wrong. Then the officer asked him if he was missing a red Pontiac Grand Prix that was registered in his name, because that car had been found abandoned on some nearby ranch land, and Mackenzie's dad felt like the room started to spin. He took a breath and told the officer that yes, that was his car and he was missing it, but the car was not important. He said the only thing he cared about was finding the person who had been driving the car, his 17-year-old daughter, Mackenzie. On the morning of February 13th, 2010, so 4 days after Mackenzie's car had been found, police, local volunteers, and even members of the FBI were searching all over town for Mackenzie. They had spent the last few days knocking on doors in every neighborhood in the area, hoping that someone had seen her, but they still hadn't had any luck. And so it seemed like once Mackenzie left the parking lot at her cosmetology school after going for her 15-minute break, she had just vanished. Then, at 12:45 p.m., a man was walking on the banks of the Columbia River, about 25 miles away from Wenatchee, in an area known for its great hiking trails. The man listened to the river running nearby and breathed in the crisp winter air. Then suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. He shielded his eyes from the sun to get a better look at something several yards in front of him by the water's edge. And when the man realized what he was looking at, he immediately started running towards the water and shouting, and when he got to the edge of the water, he crouched down on the ground and just started shaking his head, like he couldn't believe what he was looking at. He had seen a person lying on the ground, and he hoped they were just sleeping, or at worst, they were injured. But now that he was up close, he knew he was looking at a dead body. The man's hands started shaking, and he looked around for anybody else to help, but he was alone. So he took a deep breath and steadied himself, then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and called 911. Not long after that 911 call, Chief Deputy Robin Wagg of the Douglas County Sheriff's Department walked down the banks of the Columbia River towards a group of police officers and forensics technicians. Wagg was a big guy with a steady voice, and he was known for always remaining calm under pressure. But when Wagg saw the body near the river, he got mad, because he knew immediately the victim was 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell. Mackenzie's picture had been sent to the law enforcement agencies in the area, and her face had been all over the news for the past few days while people had been searching for her. And as Wagg looked down at Mackenzie, he felt shaken, and not just because of how young she looked, but because Mackenzie had a knife sticking straight out of her shoulder. Wagg hadn't seen anything like that before, and he couldn't imagine what kind of a person would do something so violent, especially to someone so young who had her whole life ahead of her. But Wagg couldn't spend any time trying to figure out a potential killer's motives just yet, because he saw Mackenzie's feet were already in the water, and he knew the river level would rise throughout the day, and so the body, and any evidence around it, were in danger of being washed away. So Wagg ordered the team on site to start their search for evidence with the body, and then to make their way outward further away from the water. And so that day, the investigative team worked as quickly as they could as they raced against the rising river. Normally, Wagg would have wanted to inform the victim's family in person, but the time crunch he was under meant he needed to stay at the crime scene. And on top of that, he had to inform FBI agents who'd been helping with the search for Mackenzie about what they had found. And after the FBI was notified, they were the ones to contact Mackenzie's dad. And so while police searched the crime scene, Mackenzie's dad sat at home, and he was still desperately hoping to hear some good news from the search party who were looking for his daughter. But then his phone rang, and an FBI agent on the other line introduced herself and said that she was so sorry to be giving this information over the phone and not in person, and Mackenzie's dad knew before she even said it what he was about to hear. The agent informed Mackenzie's father that police had found his daughter's body on the banks of the river, and Mackenzie's dad just went completely silent, and he felt like his whole world had just shattered. And not long after that call, while Mackenzie's dad informed his fiancée, his ex-wife, and other family members about what he had just heard, police continued their search on the riverbank. And before the river water got too high, they were able to pull blood and hair samples from Mackenzie's body and the knife found in her shoulder. And a little further up the riverbank, they found 5 feet of duct tape that was spattered with blood. So, over the next few days, while the blood samples and physical evidence were sent to the lab for tests, Deputy Wag and his investigative team started talking to anybody who they thought might know something about what had happened to Mackenzie. They interviewed Mackenzie's family, and they met with friends and teachers from her high school, and at Mackenzie's cosmetology school, they talked to the woman who Mackenzie had told she was leaving for that 15-minute break. And they spoke to Chris Wilson, the man whose mom owned a salon. But all anybody seemed to know was that Mackenzie had gone out to the parking lot for this break and then just never came back. But then a woman contacted the police and told them that she thought she had seen a thin, dark-haired young man walking away from Mackenzie's red Pontiac Grand Prix not long after it had been abandoned. But that description could fit a wide range of people. So, Wag shifted his search from Mackenzie's school life to her life online to see if he could narrow down his search for this thin, dark-haired young man. And so, detectives began looking at Mackenzie's social media pages on sites like Facebook and MySpace, and Mackenzie's social media posts led police right to a young man who fit the witness's description, Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano. On an early morning, about a week after Mackenzie's body was found on the banks of the Columbia River, Chief Deputy Wag walked through the Douglas County Sheriff's Department into a small interrogation room. Wag watched as a technician wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Joaquin Villasano's arm to prep him for a polygraph, or lie detector test. Joaquin was thin with dark hair, and he wore a t-shirt and jeans. And under the bright fluorescent lights overhead, Wag could see that Joaquin was visibly nervous. Then, Wag entered the room and took a seat next to several officers who were already inside there. In the days following the discovery of Mackenzie's body, different law enforcement agencies had come together to form a task force for the murder investigation. And so now, Wag and other investigators from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department were joined by members of the Wenatchee Police, the Washington State Police, and the FBI, and all of them were eager to hear what Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin, had to say. The room got quiet, and then, in a calm voice, the investigator leading Joaquin's polygraph test asked if Joaquin was a gangster, because they had seen social media posts that supposedly celebrated gang behavior. But Joaquin said no, he just really loved hip-hop music, and some of his favorite artists talked about gang life in their songs. Then the investigator asked if Joaquin had met up with Mackenzie after they exchanged text messages on the day she died. But Joaquin said after he had sent the response text just saying, "Hey," he never heard from or saw Mackenzie again. Wag noticed that almost every time Joaquin answered a question, he looked down at the floor, and Wag knew that could be a sign that Joaquin was lying or trying to avoid the question. But Wag also thought this kid might just be painfully shy. Then finally, the investigator asked Joaquin if he had killed Mackenzie, and Joaquin said no. He said he loved her. But by the end of the session, investigators still weren't sure what to make of Joaquin. Several answers he'd given had been inconclusive on the polygraph test, so there was a chance that he'd told several lies. But Wag and the others didn't want to condemn Joaquin without conclusive proof, and so far, all they really had was the text message that Joaquin had sent in response to Mackenzie's text on the day that she had died. And neither of those text messages were substantive, they just said, "Hey." And so investigators knew they had to find something more concrete than that if they wanted to hold Joaquin, but Joaquin's interrogation and conversations with some of Mackenzie's friends and family led them to another potential suspect, because almost all of the people police talked to had pointed them to someone who they said Mackenzie fought with all the time. And so, as the investigation moved forward, Wag started to think that maybe Mackenzie's boyfriend was not the killer. However, maybe Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend was. About a week after Mackenzie's body had been discovered, Wag and other members of the task force started to look deeper into the relationship Mackenzie had with her mother's boyfriend. And almost everything they found out made it clear that Mackenzie and her mother's boyfriend argued a lot. And then, Mackenzie's dad told investigators that the night before Mackenzie had gone missing, she had given her mother an ultimatum and said her mother had to choose between Mackenzie and her boyfriend. So, on a cold February afternoon, investigators went to Mackenzie's mother's house. But when they met with the boyfriend, it was a quick conversation. He admitted he and Mackenzie did not get along, but he said he would never do anything to hurt her. And he said he was nowhere near Mackenzie at the time she was murdered, and that multiple people could vouch for his whereabouts. And when Wag followed up on his alibi, it checked out. Still, Wag was not ready to write off any potential suspects just yet. But after meeting Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend, Wag still thought Mackenzie's own boyfriend, Joaquin, seemed like a much stronger lead. And the test results that came back from the lab confirmed that genetic material found on that knife in Mackenzie's arm and on the blood-spattered duct tape belonged to a male. And the violent nature of the attack led Wag to believe it had been carried out by someone who knew Mackenzie and that it could have been a crime of passion. And so Wag felt like he was still on the right path with Joaquin. On February 25, 2010, over 2 weeks after Mackenzie's murder, 1,800 people filled the stands of the arena where the local hockey team played. They had all come together to celebrate Mackenzie's life at a public memorial service. The owner of the hockey team had paid for the entire service and had made sure that the ice on the hockey rink was covered with a floor so Mackenzie's dance team, the Applettes, could perform a routine in her honor. And at the end of that dance routine, all of the dancers hugged and cried. And none of them could believe that their friend Mackenzie, who loved dancing as much as they did, would never get to perform with them ever again. And during that memorial service, members of the audience were very moved by that dance performance and the effect it had on the dancers. They saw how emotional they were getting. And so the audience got really upset and angry, and a lot of the people in attendance decided they needed to do something to help find Mackenzie's killer. So, in the weeks following the memorial, business leaders in the community came together and started a reward fund, offering almost $40,000 to anyone who had information that led police to the person who had committed this horrific crime. Chief Deputy Wag hoped the reward might bring someone forward who had been unwilling to talk to police before. And he hoped someone would be able to shed light on new evidence because he still didn't have enough to link Joaquin to Mackenzie's murder, and he really had no other viable suspects. But then, in early April, over a month after the memorial, a call came in to the police that would turn the entire investigation on its head. In early April, about 2 months after Mackenzie's murder, Chief Deputy Wag was sitting at his desk when a fellow officer rushed in looking very excited. And the officer told Wag that they had just gotten a call from a woman who said she knew exactly who killed Mackenzie and how they had done it. So Wag took down the woman's information and quickly set up an interview with her. Her name was Liz Reed, and she was a low-level drug dealer who had worked as a police informant in the past to help police catch bigger drug traffickers in the area. And so not long after Wag contacted her, Liz came to the station. And when Wag and other members of the task force sat across from her in the interrogation room, they were blown away by what they heard. Liz told them that 2 major dealers she knew had bragged to her about being the ones who had killed Mackenzie Cowell. But she said that wasn't all, because these dealers had made Liz watch a video, what they called a snuff film, that actually showed Mackenzie's murder. And then Liz gave police another piece of evidence that she said would make it clear that these drug dealers were really the killers. She said that after they forced her to watch this snuff film, they had sent her out to the banks of the Columbia River, close to where Mackenzie's body had been found, and the dealers had told Liz that they needed to find a ring that had fallen off of Mackenzie's finger by the river when they had killed her. Liz told police she had gone searching for the ring, but she couldn't find it. After meeting with Liz, Wag and the other investigators shifted their focus from Mackenzie's boyfriend Joaquin to the drug dealers Liz had mentioned. Wag was not going to just take Liz at her word, but she had been a good police informant in the past, so he at least considered her story credible. And so, with all of the details Liz had provided, investigators set out to track down the drug dealers, to find the ring Liz had mentioned, and to locate the snuff film she said would prove who killed Mackenzie. And it turned out that finding the drug dealers was not that hard. They were well known by police in the area, and so not long after talking to Liz, investigators questioned them. But not surprisingly to the police, the dealers denied everything, and they claimed to have no idea who Mackenzie was, other than what they had seen on the news. But police were not ready to just accept the word of 2 known drug dealers, so they continued to pursue this new lead. And on April 20th, over 2 months after Mackenzie's murder, several members of the investigative team were back on the banks of the Columbia River. They were combing the area around where Mackenzie's body had been found, looking for the ring Liz had told them about. But it had been months since the murder, and the depth of the river water fluctuated so much. So officers worried that if they really had missed something as important as a ring the first time around, it would have been washed away by now. But the officers walked up and down the banks, searching every inch of land, and at times one of them would get down on the ground and dig through rocks and dirt where they thought they might have found something, but each time the excitement quickly disappeared when they realized they had not found the ring. Then, suddenly, one of the officers stopped in his tracks. He thought the sunlight had bounced off of something near his feet. He knew it most likely was a rock, like all the other times he thought he had found the ring, but he wanted to make sure. So he got down on the ground and moved his eyes across the dirt, but at first he couldn't see anything. Then the sun shined just right again, and something caught his eye, and he bent down even further and started digging the dirt away, and his eyes lit up, because he was staring at a ring just like the one the police informant Liz had described. And later that day, when Chief Deputy Wag and other task force leaders got a look at this new evidence, they thought they might finally have something that would prove who killed Mackenzie. And so Wag and a member of the Wenatchee Police Department took the ring and drove all over town, and they showed it to Mackenzie's parents, her family, and her friends from high school and cosmetology school, but not one of them recognized the ring. So Wag took one final step, and he went directly to the young man who had been his prime suspect, Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin. But Joaquin looked at the ring over and over again, and he said he'd never seen Mackenzie wear anything like it. And all of a sudden, this piece of evidence that had looked so promising proved to be yet another dead end. But even though nobody in Mackenzie's life recognized that ring, investigators still didn't give up on the drug dealer angle. In fact, they spent months following the lead they'd received from their informant Liz, but they could never find any connection between these supposed killers and Mackenzie, and the horrific snuff film Liz had told them about never surfaced. And then finally, months after Liz had first contacted police, she told them she had made the entire story up. There was no snuff film, the ring had been planted on the beach, and the drug dealers had nothing to do with Mackenzie's murder. Months later, Liz would try to go back again on her story and claim she was actually telling the truth about the drug dealers having killed Mackenzie, but the damage to her credibility was done, and so police refused to listen to her. And so, by July of 2010, 5 months after Mackenzie's murder, Wag and other investigators felt like they had lost valuable time and spent valuable resources pursuing a lead that was very likely a lie. They believed Liz was just a desperate informant who was either trying to deflect from her own drug crimes or who badly wanted that $40,000 reward money for information that led to Mackenzie's killer. And so, Wag kept trying to move the investigation forward, but the summer heat and the return of the apples to the orchards made it clear to him just how long the search for Mackenzie's killer was taking. And he knew people in town, and everybody who loved Mackenzie, were giving up hope. But then, investigators got another call from a police informant, and unlike Liz, they still trusted this informant. And the call they got from him would lead investigators to a new key piece of evidence, and they would finally find Mackenzie's killer. Based on the call from this new informant, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and physical evidence found at multiple locations, here is a reconstruction of what members of the investigation task force believe happened to Mackenzie Cowell on the day she died, February 9th, 2010. On that February day, a few minutes after 3:45 p.m., the killer followed Mackenzie's car into the parking lot of an apartment complex. The killer watched Mackenzie step out of the car holding her purse, and immediately, a look of complete calm came across the killer's face. Then the killer stepped out of the car, put a smile on, and called out to Mackenzie. Mackenzie turned around, she waved and smiled, and walked right over to them. Then the killer led Mackenzie up a flight of stairs and into a small one-bedroom apartment. Mackenzie walked into the living room that was kind of cramped, put her purse down on the coffee table, and then she smiled even wider at the killer. The place wasn't much to look at with its old carpet, low ceilings, and a few small rooms, but Mackenzie got excited thinking about a time in the near future when she would be able to get an apartment just like this one, where she could live on her own or with one of her friends. The killer said they were going to grab a glass of water in the kitchen and they'd be right back. And so Mackenzie just stood in the living room, daydreaming again about the freedom she'd get to experience once she graduated from high school. In the kitchen, the killer turned on the sink to let the water run, but instead of getting a cup of water, they opened a drawer, took out a roll of duct tape, and put it on the counter. Then they opened another drawer and looked at all the knives inside, and one knife caught their eye. It was a kitchen knife with a sharp blade and a sleek black and gray handle, something that a chef might use. So the killer reached into the drawer, took that knife out, and held it up in front of them. And just feeling the knife grip in their hand got the killer excited. But they took a breath and kept that look of complete calm on their face. Then the killer turned off the water, picked up the duct tape, held the knife down by their side, and walked back into the living room. The killer saw Mackenzie looking around the room with her back turned to them. And so the killer leaned over and put the duct tape and the knife on a coffee table not far from Mackenzie, and when Mackenzie turned to see what the killer was doing, the killer suddenly lunged at her and shoved her down. Mackenzie fell backwards and slammed her head into the carpeted floor, and immediately the killer climbed on top of her and wrapped their hands around her throat. Mackenzie tried to scream, but the life was being choked out of her, and she could feel herself drifting out of consciousness. Then the killer released Mackenzie's throat, but stayed on top of her to keep her pinned down. The killer reached back behind them, grabbed the duct tape from the table, ripped off a long piece, and quickly bound Mackenzie's hands with it. Mackenzie tried to fight back, but she could barely move. Then the killer reached back to the table again, grabbed the knife, and slashed Mackenzie's throat. Blood spilled from Mackenzie onto the carpet, and she took her last breath. The killer stood over Mackenzie for a minute, just watching her die, and then when she went still, they raised the knife and slammed it into her shoulder, and then began trying to saw her arm off. But the knife wasn't made for that, and the killer realized they didn't have the time or supplies to do exactly what they had wanted. So the killer left the knife in Mackenzie's shoulder, and they went back to the kitchen and washed the blood off their hands and face. Then they walked back through the apartment, grabbed Mackenzie's purse, darted outside to the parking lot, and walked to Mackenzie's red Pontiac. The killer dug through Mackenzie's purse, found her car keys, and got into the car, fired it up. Then they drove that car outside of town onto a secluded dirt road by a ranch. Once they had parked the car, the killer got outside and calmly walked back down the road as the sun started to set. And they walked several miles back to their apartment, and by the time they got back, it was dark outside, and inside, Mackenzie's body was still on the floor. And days later, the killer drove Mackenzie's body, with the knife still sticking out of it, to the banks of the Columbia River and left it there. And a few days after that, the killer told the cosmetology school they attended that they would be taking a leave of absence. Chris Wilson, Mackenzie's classmate at beauty school, whose mother owned a salon, had murdered Mackenzie and then attempted to dismember her. He tried to cut off her arm, but realized he couldn't, and so just kind of stopped. And in terms of Chris's motive, all we know is that Chris was totally obsessed with death, serial killers, and movie murderers. And he showed off this obsession with death with his tattoo of Hannibal Lecter, the killer cannibal from the movie Silence of the Lambs. Chris had even spent time working at a funeral home, likely because he loved being around dead bodies, but he had been fired because the funeral director said that Chris had started to do some things that made the rest of the staff feel very uncomfortable. But none of this was known to Chief Deputy Wag and the investigation task force until they received the call from that second police informant. This informant was in jail, but he hoped providing information about Mackenzie's killer might help him with his own case. So he contacted police and told them that Chris was one of Mackenzie's cosmetology school classmates, and that Chris was actually very dangerous and was totally obsessed with murder. And after the police got this call, they met with Chris, and they saw Chris's dyed black hair and thin frame, and they knew he fit the description from the witness who had seen a dark-haired, thin young man walking away from Mackenzie's abandoned car. And then police checked security camera footage of the cosmetology school from the day of Mackenzie's murder, and on one of the videos, Chris could be seen leaving the school and heading into the parking lot about a minute after Mackenzie was seen leaving on the video. And so with all of this new information, investigators asked Chris to submit to a DNA test, and those test results showed Chris had possible links to the genetic material found on the knife used to stab Mackenzie and on the blood-spattered duct tape found near Mackenzie's body. And DNA testing would also provide police with the piece of evidence that ultimately turned the case around. Because when they searched Chris's apartment, police found a blood stain deep in the living room carpet, and tests done on that piece of carpet showed that the blood belonged to Mackenzie. And police heard from other cosmetology school students that Chris and Mackenzie might have been developing a relationship, which is why she would have been comfortable going to his apartment. Then, police found pictures on Chris's phone that he had taken of his female friend posing as a dead body in his living room right on the spot where Mackenzie's blood had been found, and so investigators were certain that Chris was the killer. Investigators believed they had proven beyond a doubt that Chris committed first-degree murder, but the district attorney had reservations because there was no clear-cut evidence that placed Chris in the apartment at the time of Mackenzie's murder, and no evidence that Chris actually drove Mackenzie's body to the river. And so, Chris was able to sign a plea deal in which he confessed to killing Mackenzie, and in exchange for that confession, he was only charged with manslaughter and sentenced to just 14 years in prison with a potential early release in 2023. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, Or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I got to tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on these specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. And he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear and she gets up as slowly as she can and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now. Confirmed. They are right downstairs and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you looked through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know. And so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel. And so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting and she was this really nice lady. And so even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful, and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what? I'm just going to take my medication. I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on Netflix and I'm going to eat this salad in bed. It's going to be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed, she's eating her salad, she's watching Portlandia, and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed and it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side, just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911 and she's ready to dial it, and she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked, everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred. Because in her mind, in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided, it's time to tell my parents. And so when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud. And it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind. And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall. And he pushes on it and he taps on it and he sees if there's any sort of special compartment. There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of this closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, come back here so I can look at you. And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, "Come over here." He showed her what's in her closet and he said, "Did you write that?" And she goes, "No." And he goes, "All right, it's time to leave." They walk outside, they go to his truck, and he calls the police and he says, "Someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment." Police show up and using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her. And he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up, and anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do, and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it so he would know it was happening, he would put sleeping pills in her food, he would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep, and he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment, and what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble, well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was terribly sorry, but their friendship ended. On October 17th, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you got to remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles, such as theft, vandalism, revenge, have basically been crossed off. Not to mention, there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide, we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go, and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything, they're not hearing anything, and they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs, and as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms, and one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out. And they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times. He was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip. And so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going through the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, what are you doing in my kitchen? In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had